I have been really enjoying the new Netflix series House of Guinness, which is a somewhat fictionalized portrayal of the family who inherited the Guinness Company, producers of one of my favorite drinks, especially when I'm in Europe, Guinness. But that got me digging, as I often do, into more of the story and looking into the real history behind Guinness, behind the family, and behind their connection to the people of Ireland. And I ended up finding out that they have a very interesting connection to the Great War. And so I thought in today's episode we would explore the story of the House of Guinness and its involvement directly in the Great War. In the summer of 1914, Dublin was a city of profound contradictions. It was a place where vibrant culture and simmering political tension existed side by side. It was the second city of the British Empire, but it was also the heart of a burgeoning Irish nationalism that was straining at the seams of imperial control. The very air was thick with the debate over home rule, a form of limited self-government for Ireland that had been promised by the British Liberal government. The Third Home Rule Bill had finally become law in September of 1914, but its implementation was immediately suspended for the duration of the war that had just erupted across Europe. This suspension left Ireland in a state of precarious political limbo, a nation on the brink of both long-awaited autonomy and potential civil war. The political landscape was fractured and volatile. On one side stood the constitutional nationalists, led by John Redmond and the Irish Parliamentary Party, who believed that by demonstrating loyalty to the British war effort, they would secure the implementation of home rule once the conflict was over. On the other side were the Unionists, concentrated in the northern province of Ulster, but present throughout Ireland. And they vehemently opposed home rule and pledged their loyalty to the Crown and to the United Kingdom. Both factions had raised their own private armies in the years leading up to 1914, the pro-home rule Irish Volunteers and the anti-home rule Ulster Volunteer Force. With both sides armed and organized, Ireland was a tinderbox awaiting a spark. Now, beneath this political turmoil lay a complex social and economic reality. While the turn of the century had brought improvements in transport, public health, and education, Ireland still grappled with the long shadows of the Great Famine. Poverty, unemployment, and emigration remained persistent problems, particularly outside the industrial powerhouse of Belfast. In Dublin, the death rate was high, and diseases like bronchitis and tuberculosis were rampant killers. In this environment, a steady, secure job wasn't merely a source of income. It was a shield against the precarity that defined life for so many. It was a golden ticket. And nowhere in Ireland was there a more coveted ticket than a job at the St. James's Gate Brewery, the home of Guinness. The Guinness Brewery wasn't simply a large employer. It was an institution. A city within a city that dominated the physical and economic landscape of Dublin. By 1914, it was the largest brewery in the world, a sprawling industrial complex that had long since bought out all its local competitors. It was one of Ireland's largest single private employers, with a workforce of around 3,650, meaning that, including families, some 11,000 people in Dublin were directly dependent on the brewery for their livelihood. Competition for a job at the gate was famously stiff, requiring school references, medical exams, and written tests, even for 14-year-old boys starting as messengers. To be a Guinness man was to be a part of a system of corporate paternalism that was unparalleled in Ireland and rare throughout the entire world. The Guinness family, who were prominent members of the Anglo-Irish Protestant establishment and steadfastly loyal to the British Crown, had implemented a revolutionary series of welfare schemes for their largely Catholic working-class employees. By 1907, these schemes were costing the company around £40,000 per year, which was a fifth of its entire wage bill. This was a system of care described by Dubliners as lasting from womb to tomb. The benefits were extraordinary for the era. Employees received subsidized meals, paid annual holidays, and a daily allowance of Guinness Stout. They had access to free, comprehensive medical and dental care for themselves and their families, with a company midwife on staff to assist with childbirths. The company provided generous pensions that crucially would transfer to a man's widow upon his death, offering a safety net that was almost unheard of at the time. There were even burial allowances provided by the company to ensure a dignified end. This cradle-to-grave security created an environment of immense stability and fostered a powerful bond of loyalty between the workers and the company. In a city where life could be uncertain and harsh, a job at Guinness was a guarantee of a better life. This deep-seated loyalty, forged over decades of benevolent paternalism, wasn't merely a feature of industrial relations, it was a social contract. When the call for military volunteers came in 1914, this contract would be tested, and the loyalty of the Guinness men would be called upon in a way no one could ever have imagined. When the United Kingdom declared war on Germany on August 4th, 1914, Ireland, as an integral part of the kingdom, was automatically committed to the conflict. The initial response across the island was largely supportive, mirroring the patriotic fervor that was seen in Britain. Both nationalists and unionist leaders, for their own distinct reasons, backed the British war effort, and a wave of voluntary enlistment began. For the men of the Guinness Brewery, the decision to enlist was shaped by this national context, but was ultimately filtered through the unique lens of their relationship with their employer, a relationship that would see the company make an unprecedented promise to its workers. Over the course of the war, more than 200,000 Irishmen would serve in the British Armed Forces. Their motivations for joining were as varied and complex as society from which they came. For many nationalists, the call to arms from their leader, John Redmond, was in itself persuasive. He argued that by fighting for the rights of small nations like Catholic Belgium against German aggression, Irishmen would prove their worthiness and ensure that home rule would be granted without delay as soon as the war was over. For Unionists, particularly in Ulster, the motivation was more straightforward. It was a patriotic duty to defend the king and the empire in its hour of need. Beyond these high-minded political ideals, more practical considerations drove enlistment as well. For thousands of men facing poverty or unemployment, the British Army offered a steady job with reliable pay and benefits, a way to put food on the table for their families. The Army pay, combined with the separation allowance for wives and dependents, represented a significant economic incentive. For others, especially the young, the war offered a chance for adventure, an escape from the mundane, rural or urban life, and an opportunity to see the world. As Tom Barry, who would later become a famous IRA commander, recalled of his own enlistment in 1915 at the age of 17, he said, quote, "I went to the war for no other reason than that I wanted to see what war was like, to get a gun, to see new countries, and to feel like a grown man," end quote. Social pressures also played a significant role as men joined in groups with their friends, workmates, and neighbors. Within this national wave of recruitment, the response from the St. James's Gate Brewery was immediate and decisive. The company's management, reflecting the loyalist and pro-British sympathies of the Guinness family, actively encouraged its employees to join up with the British forces. But Guinness went far beyond mere encouragement. It put in place a policy of support for its enlisted men and their families that was arguably the most generous of any private company in the British Empire. The Guinness Pledge consisted of 3 core components that effectively removed the greatest anxieties a working man would face when considering whether to join up for military service. First, and most importantly, the company guaranteed to pay half of a man's ordinary wages to his family for every week he was away in the conflict. This, combined with the Army's separation allowance, meant that the families of Guinness soldiers were financially secure, a stark contrast to the hardship faced by many other soldiers' dependents. Second, every man who enlisted was given an ironclad guarantee that his job would be waiting for him upon his return. This removed the fear of being cast into unemployment after surviving the war. Finally, the company provided direct support to the men at the front. A war gifts committee was established within the brewery to assemble and dispatch parcels containing items like chocolate and condensed milk, providing a tangible link to home and a reminder that the company still cared about them. Special war bonuses were also paid out by the company. This extraordinary policy fundamentally altered the calculus of enlistment for a Guinness employee. Unlike an unemployed laborer who joined the army out of economic necessity, a Guinness man already possessed one of the most secure and well-paid jobs in all of Ireland. The primary deterrent to him enlisting, the potential destitution of his family, was completely removed by the company's pledge. This meant that the decision to volunteer wasn't driven by a lack of options, but was a conscious choice to leave a life of unparalleled security behind. It was a choice rooted in patriotism, a sense of duty, loyalty to the company, or the spirit of adventure, underwritten by the very employer they were leaving. Over 800 employees, from the board of directors and top management down to the laborers in the brew house and the coopers in the cask yards, would take up this offer and trade the black stuff for the khaki uniform. The journey for the more than 800 Guinness men who volunteered for the Great War was a stark transition from the structured, secure world of the St. James's Gate Brewery to the chaotic, industrialized slaughter of the modern battlefield. They came from every department, the brew house, the cooperage, the engineer's office, and they served across the globe on land, at sea, and in the air. Many served in the famous Irish regiments, particularly the Royal Dublin Fusiliers, the Royal Irish Fusiliers, and the Irish Guards. Their story is one of immense bravery and devastating loss, bookended by the first casualty in the war's opening weeks and the last long after the armistice had been signed. The first Guinness employee that we have a record for to die in the war was Private Thomas McDonough, a 25-year-old cleaner in the engineers department. McDonough was an Army reservist with the 1st Battalion Irish Guards. He was recalled to the colors on August 5th, 1914, just a day after the British declaration of war, and was deployed to France just a week later. On September 8th, 1914, during the fierce fighting at the First Battle of the Marne that halted the initial German advance on Paris, he died of his wounds. He had been at war for less than a month. The final name on the list of the fallen tells a different but equally tragic story. Private James Kennedy was a 31-year-old laborer from the Cook's Lane Maltings who had enlisted in March 1915 with the 1st Battalion Royal Dublin Fusiliers. He survived the horrors of the Western Front only to fall victim to the great influenza pandemic that swept the globe in the war's aftermath. He died at a military hospital in Shropshire on April 9th, 1919, 5 months after the fighting had come to an end. His death was a final, cruel postscript to the conflict, marking him as the last of 104 Guinness employees who would never return. Many of the Guinness men who served within the Royal Dublin Fusiliers, who were known affectionately as the Dubs, found their baptism of fire in the ill-fated Gallipoli campaign of 1915. The 1st Battalion, a regular army unit filled with seasoned soldiers and some reservists, was part of the 29th Division, which was tasked with the amphibious landing on the tip of the Gallipoli Peninsula. On April 25, 1915, the Dubs, along with the Royal Munster Fusiliers, were packed into a converted collier, the SS River Clyde, which was to be run aground at V Beach. What followed was, well, it was a massacre. The Turkish defenders, holding the high ground in well-prepared positions, unleashed a storm of machine gun and rifle fire on the landing force. As the first boats and the gangways from the River Clyde were lowered, the men were cut down in their hundreds. An eyewitness described the sea turning crimson with blood as men, weighed down by their 60-pound packs, drowned in the shallows. Of the first 200 men to attempt to disembark from the ship, 149 were killed, and 30 more were wounded almost immediately. The casualties were so catastrophic that the remnants of the Dublin and Munster Fusiliers were merged into a single composite unit, grimly nicknamed the Dubsters. Of the roughly 1,100 men of the 1st Battalion who landed at Gallipoli, only 11 men would survive the campaign. Months later, in August, a fresh landing was attempted at Suvla Bay. This time it involved the newly formed Kitchener's Army units of the 10th Irish Division, including the 6th and 7th Battalions of the Dublins, filled with civilian volunteers. This operation was plagued by administrative incompetence. The division's artillery was mistakenly sent to France, and the men landed without maps or any clear orders. They faced a chronic shortage of water under the blazing Turkish sun. The attack stalled, and the campaign descended into a brutal stalemate of trench warfare before the Allies finally evacuated in January 1916, having suffered 250,000 casualties. Now, while the survivors of Gallipoli were redeployed to the Western Front, a seismic event was taking place back home in Dublin. On Easter Monday, April 24th, 1916, a small group of Irish Republicans launched an armed insurrection against British rule, seizing key buildings in the city center and proclaiming an Irish Republic. For a week, Dublin was a war zone. The British Army, which occupied the Guinness Brewery as a strategic position, eventually were able to crush the rebellion. Now, in a moment of supreme and tragic irony, 2 Guinness employees were killed during the fighting, not by the rebels, but by the very army their colleagues were serving. On the night of April 29th, 2 employees, William John Rice and Cecil Dockeray, were guiding a picket of British soldiers around the brewery grounds. The commander of the patrol, a colour quartermaster sergeant Robert Flood of the Royal Dublin Fusiliers, became convinced that Rice, Dockeray, and 2 British officers with them were colluding with the rebels. And in a fit of paranoia, he ordered all 4 men to be summarily executed on the spot. Sergeant Flood was later court-martialed for murder, but he was acquitted, claiming he believed his position was about to be attacked. Just over 2 months later, on July 1st, 1916, many of their brewery colleagues, including veterans of Gallipoli, went over the top in the Battle of the Somme. The 16th Irish Division and the 36th Ulster Division both took part in the massive offensive, and both suffered horrendous casualties from German machine guns and artillery. The world of the Guinness soldier had been turned upside down. While they were fighting and dying in France for a cause linked to the British Empire and the promise of home rule, a new, more radical form of Irish patriotism was being forged in the streets of their home city, a patriotism that would soon view them not as heroes, but as traitors. The war for the Guinness men wasn't confined to the trenches. The company's own fleet of steamships, which transported the famous stout to Britain, was also a target. On October 12, 1917, the SS W.M. Barclay was torpedoed and sunk by a German U-boat off the Kish Lighthouse in the Irish Sea. 5 of the crew perished, including able seaman Ernest Arthur Kendall, a Guinness employee whose name is recorded on the company's Roll of Honor. On the Western Front, the relentless attrition continued. In May 1915, at the Second Battle of Ypres, the 2nd Battalion of the Dublins was virtually annihilated in one of the first major poison gas attacks of the war. Of the battalion's nearly 670 men, 645 were killed, wounded, or driven off the battlefield by the chlorine gas. At the Third Battle of Ypres, better known as Passchendaele, in the autumn of 1917, Irish divisions once again suffered terribly in a nightmarish landscape of mud and shell craters. Yet amidst the slaughter, there were acts of incredible bravery. Captain James Plowman, a fitter from the Engineers Department serving with the Leinster Regiment, was awarded the Military Cross for gallantry in June 1917. He would die of his wounds in April 1918, one of the many decorated heroes from St. James's Gate who made the ultimate sacrifice. The concurrent events on the Western Front and the Easter Rising created an impossible dilemma for an Irish soldier. The 1914 narrative, championed by John Redmond, was that they were fighting for the freedom of small nations and thereby securing Ireland's own freedom. But that was shattered by the events in Dublin. The British execution of the Rising's leaders created a new pantheon of Irish martyrs and swung public opinion decisively toward the Republican cause of complete separation from the United Kingdom. A Guinness man in a trench in France was now caught in a historical no man's land. At home, he was increasingly seen as a pawn of the British Empire, a man in the wrong uniform fighting the wrong war. The very ground of his patriotic identity had shifted beneath him, leaving his sacrifice politically adrift and his motivations tragically misunderstood by the new Ireland that was emerging in his absence. And so it was that for the surviving Guinness men, at the end of the war in November 1918, there wasn't a simple or triumphant homecoming. They returned to an Ireland that had been irrevocably transformed, a country where their service and sacrifice were no longer celebrated but were often viewed with suspicion, hostility, or perhaps worst of all, a profound and deliberate indifference. In this new Ireland, which was rapidly moving toward independence from the very empire they had fought to defend, the brewery at St. James's Gate became more than just a place of work. It became a sanctuary of memory and respect in a nation suffering from a collective and politically convenient amnesia. As I mentioned a moment ago, the 1916 Easter Rising and the subsequent execution of its leaders had radicalized nationalist opinion. And then the British government's attempt to impose conscription in Ireland in the spring of 1918 further galvanized opposition, uniting nationalist parties, trade unions, and the powerful Catholic Church in a massive campaign of resistance. This conscription crisis effectively destroyed the moderate Irish Parliamentary Party and paved the way for the meteoric rise of Sinn Féin, the Republican Party that advocated for complete independence. In the general election of December 1918, Sinn Féin won a landslide victory across most of Ireland, but they refused to take their seats in the British Parliament at Westminster and instead established their own revolutionary Irish Parliament. In January 1919, they declared Ireland an independent republic, triggering the start of the Irish War of Independence, a brutal guerrilla conflict between the Irish Republican Army and British forces. Into this maelstrom walked the returning Irish veterans of the Great War. Their service was now a deeply inconvenient fact for the new state's founding narrative, which was built exclusively on the blood sacrifice of the 1916 rebels. As a result, the memory of more than 200,000 Irishmen who fought in the British Army was systematically marginalized, a phenomenon later described by historian F.X. Martin as, quote, national amnesia. Veterans returning to nationalist areas were often met with a grudging silence, verbal abuse, or even physical violence. They were treated as outcasts, their uniforms a symbol of loyalty to the enemy. As the poet Tom Kettle, who was a nationalist MP killed on the Somme, had once written, the 1916 leaders would go down in history as heroes and martyrs, and I will go down, if I go down at all, as a bloody British officer. Now, amidst this national forgetting, the Guinness Brewery stood as a notable exception. True to its word, the company welcomed its veterans back, honoring the promise that their jobs would be waiting for them. For many of the returning soldiers, the brewery gates at St. James's became the entrance to a safe haven, one of the few places in Dublin where their service was not a source of shame, but was acknowledged and respected. Beyond providing employment, the company took a deliberate and significant step to ensure that the contribution of its employees would not be erased from history. In December 1920, at the height of the War of Independence, the company produced a Roll of Honor. This was no mere list, but a meticulously crafted, high-quality book designed, quote, to preserve in a suitable form a record of those who gave their services and in many instances their lives for the defense of the empire, end quote. The Roll of Honor listed the names of all 800-plus employees who had served in His Majesty's naval, military, and air forces. Crucially, the names were organized not by military unit, but by the department in which the men had worked at the brewery. The accountants department, the brew house, the cooperage, the engineers department, and so on. Against each name was his rank, regiment, and any decorations he had received. The names of the 104 men who had been killed in action or died of their wounds were marked with an asterisk. In February 1920, the returning servicemen presented the directors with an illuminated address, expressing their profound gratitude to the company for its unwavering support of them and their families throughout the war. The creation of this Roll of Honor was a powerful act of remembrance against the grain of the national mood. In a new state founded upon an anti-British Republican ideology, any commemoration of service in the British Army was politically contentious. By producing this document in 1920, Guinness was making a quiet but firm statement. It was an assertion of the value of that service and of the Anglo-Irish loyalist identity it represented. By explicitly linking the men's military service to their civilian jobs at the brewery, the company was claiming them as its own, refusing to allow their memory to be shaped or erased by the ascendant political orthodoxy. The Roll of Honor was thus more than a memorial. It was a cultural and political artifact, a primary source document not only of the war, but also of the deep ideological divisions that defined post-war Ireland. The story of the Guinness men of the Great War is one of a dual conflicting legacy. On a national level, their history was buried for generations, an uncomfortable chapter in the triumphant story of Irish independence. They were men caught between two competing visions of Ireland, and their sacrifice was ultimately disowned by the nation that emerged from the conflict. Yet, on a corporate and personal level, their memory was meticulously preserved and honored. The Guinness Company, through its extraordinary wartime support and its deliberate post-war act of remembrance, created a powerful counter-narrative to the national amnesia. The Roll of Honor and the extensive personnel files preserved in the Guinness archive remain the primary guardians of this complex and tragic history. They ensure that the names of the men from the vats, the cask yards, and the engine rooms who went to war are not forgotten, standing as a testament to their service, their sacrifice, and the unique institution for which they worked. So the next time you're at a pub or at your local bar or just sitting at home and you have a glass of Guinness, raise one for the men of the Great War. Thanks for listening.